All right. Hello, everybody. Miss Lynch here. She went wireless. Boom. Yeah, I got me some little headphones. Late to the party, but that's okay. Better late than never. I'm gonna loosen that a little bit so I can hear the classroom as well. Whatever. Anywho, okay. Um, yeah. This is chapter 11, part 1. We are at the beginning of November. We have like a month left of our class. You guys are doing awesome. I know a lot of people are still without power, and it's just been a real doozy of a time. So you guys are doing awesome. Just stick it out. We're getting there. All right. Yeah, so this is chapter 11, like I said, and this chapter is harsh. Okay, it's all about slavery, the entire thing. So just kind of get ready for that if you haven't already looked through things ahead of time. So, yeah, we will get through this stuff together. All right. So, in the book, it is entitled The Peculiar Institution because that's how it was referred to at the time, which gives it this endearing quality, right? But we're talking about slavery when it comes down to it. All right, so the essence of this chapter is we are going to see how it, try to maybe see if I can do something like this because I don't know where the microphone is. So I'll leave it there in case, but that way I can hear because otherwise I feel like I have vertigo. Okay. Um, yes, the essence of this chapter is to see how slavery, we already have talked about how it rooted itself in the South, the American South. Um, and we have talked about at the turn of the century, going into the 1800s, the importation of slaves from Africa ends. And so the industry, the institution will just reinforce itself in the South over the 1800s, the first half, going up to the Civil War. Okay. So that's where we're at. We're going to see that shift and how this reinforcement happens. So this will kind of take us through the 1840s is where we should end up. Yeah, we'll mostly be looking at 1830s today. And then 1840s we'll start to really get into the conversation about abolition and the uprising, the resurgence in the national conversation about slavery altogether. Okay, but so for this chapter, we're just going to talk about how it becomes, it's already a monster, but how it just builds upon itself through the early 1800s. Okay, so this chapter sucks. I'm sorry, it really does, but we have to talk about it. So, yeah, it's emotional. It's a lot to take in. So, ugh, all right. I'm on like a raw nerve today. I'm gonna try to keep it together, but here we go. All right. Anywho, okay. Well, we'll start off by talking about Frederick Douglass, okay, who is a very important figure in history, and you've probably heard about him already. So, if you haven't, I encourage you to look into his story outside of what I'm going to mention because it's just kind of brief, okay? But so, in the age of the self-made man, quote unquote, no American rose dramatically, more dramatically, from humble origins to national and international distinction than Frederick Douglass. All right. He was born into slavery in 1818 in Maryland. His mother was a slave, and his father was an unidentified Caucasian man, so who could have possibly been Frederick's owner and his mother's. We don't know. Okay. But so Douglass became a major figure in the crusade for abolition. So as we get into the conversation, like I said, we'll talk about how abolition becomes um, There will be a resurgence in the conversation about it. He's a huge figure in that. Okay. So, and I know that some people are doing their research projects on abolition, so you probably uh, have hopefully looked into Frederick Douglass and are familiar with him. Okay. But so he learned to read and write on his own. And in 1838, he escaped to the north from Maryland, and he became the most influential African American of the 19th century and the nation's preeminent advocate for racial equality. So, like I said, in the conversation of abolition, he is kind of the leading voice. All right. Okay. So let's look at the Old South. And we talked about this, so you should hopefully by this point already know which crops were our main uh, staples of Southern agriculture. So it was things like, well, sugar in the Caribbean, and then tobacco a little further north, indigo, which is the dye that goes into denim, but more than anything, it was cotton. Okay. Okay, so cotton was king, right? It replaced sugar as the world's major crop that was produced by slave labor in the 19th century. And the United States became the center for New World slavery during this time. So, the strength of American slavery, aka the peculiar institution, like I said, rested on cotton. And this division of free versus slave societies was divided by the Mason-Dixon line. So, I have a map here in a second, so I'll get to that. But this was named after Charles Mason. I almost said Charles Mason. Charles Mason and Jeremiah Dixon. So our Mason-Dixon line. And it was drawn, there's a typo in my PowerPoint, I apologize, drawn by these two surveyors in the 18th century to settle a boundary dispute between Maryland and Pennsylvania. All right. This eventually became the dividing line between slavery and freedom. And so if you go to the next slide, you can see that line. All right. So north versus south. Okay. All right. So because of the early industrial revolution, we've talked about this, our factory system in the north, uh, cotton became by far the most important commodity in international trade. And 75% of the world's cotton supply came from the southern United States and was manufactured into cloth and textiles by northern mills. All right. Okay. Cotton supplied the textile mills in the North and in Great Britain. By 1860, it represented well over half of the total value of exports coming out of the United States. So cotton truly was king during this time. It accounted for, yeah. Oh, and then I just repeated that same fact. Whoops, sorry. Okay, anyhow. Okay. All right. So looking forward a little bit, on the eve of the Civil War, so this will be by 1860, the slave population was close to 4 million. Excuse me. In the South as a whole, slaves made up a third of the total population. And in the cotton producing states of the Deep South, which I have a map that I'll ask you guys to look at here in a sec, or you can go ahead and go to it. It's on 315, but this shows the slave population in 1860. Okay, so slaves made up a third of the total population in the South, and in the cotton producing states of the Deep South, it was half of the population. And this began expanding westward into Arkansas, Louisiana, and Texas. We talked about Missouri last time, the Missouri Compromise, and yeah, it was important because the institution of slavery was beginning to move westward, and this is why it becomes a conversation again when it does, because yeah, people are concerned about it moving westward. So it's shown in those states. Okay, so although the African slave trade had been prohibited in 1808, which we talked about, the sale and trade of slaves within the United States flourished. So like I said at the beginning of this, it will just it flourishes, it reinforces itself, it grows, it becomes this whole new beast. Okay. So more than 2 million slaves were sold between 1820 and 1860. The main business districts of southern cities contained the offices of slave traders, and auctions took place at public slave markets. And then there's that map that I asked you to go ahead and look at. Okay, so like I said, this is happening in the south, but it's also being reinforced by markets in the north too. Okay. Um, I think I might have misspoke and said north twice, but that's okay. Started in the south, reinforced by the north if I misspoke. Um, okay, so let's go to our next slide. Slavery and the nation. So this is not just a southern problem. This is nationwide, is what this is getting into. Okay. So southern newspapers carried advertisements for slave sales. Southern banks financed slave trading. Southern ships and railroads carried slaves from buyers to sellers, and southern states, I should say, and municipalities earned revenue by taxing the sale of slaves. Okay, so this is deeply, deeply ingrained in every aspect of the southern market. Okay. Okay, so the North was not immune to slavery, like I've been saying. Slavery shaped the lives of all Americans. This was a nationwide problem. Northern merchants and manufacturers participated in the slave economy and shared in its profits. And this was done within shipping, like I said, banks, again, involved in every avenue of this. Insurers and our factory system, which took cotton and made it into fabric, which was then sold to markets. Okay, our public market, our national market, the people. All right. Okay. So the Southern economy. Okay. So the upper South. So um, Maryland, what would have been our, our Chesapeake area. Okay. So the upper South had more industry and diversification compared to the deep South that only focused on cotton. Okay. And the Southern economic growth of the time was different from that of the Northern. And this is something I've talked about. I've hit on this a few times. Okay. So, yeah. And like I just said a second ago, the Deep South, they're focusing on cotton only. Factories in the North were manufacturing all sorts of stuff. So it's not just textile mills that are relying on cotton as well. There's a diversification that's going on. All right. Um, we'll get to this later, but when the Civil War ends and slavery is abolished, the fact that the South had relied only on cotton creates this devastation that will lead to the Jim Crow era and sharecropping and all of that because that's all they know there was cotton. Okay. So this diversification in other areas is important to make a note of. Okay. Yeah, so our economic growth is different, North versus South. Focus on cotton limited the growth of industry in the South, like I said, and the area discouraged immigrants from entering the region. All right. Extreme racism is going on, so that makes sense that people would not want to go there, right? Okay, so discouraged immigration into the area, and it also inhibited technological growth, again, only focusing on cotton and not other industries, all right? Okay, did not share in the urban growth experienced in the rest of the country. There were few large cities in the South, mostly large plantation holdings, okay, so rural by and large. Okay, and cities were mainly centers for gathering and shipping cotton. Railroads are going there. They're holding, like we had talked about a minute ago. They're having slave auctions there. That's the hub of this industry. Yeah. Okay. New Orleans was the only city in significant size in the South. And then other than that, Charleston would have been, the other main city. Eventually Atlanta as well. Okay. So the region produced less than 10% of the nation's manufactured goods, again, because it's so limited to cotton. Slavery proved very profitable for most owners, which makes, yeah, of course, um, when you have that power over other human lives, it only makes sense that you can manipulate that to um, profits for yourself, right? Okay. Yeah. And so during this time, the United States became the leading exporter of slave grown crops. All right. So, quote unquote, plain folk in the Old South, this means Caucasian Southerners. So, our Yemen class, you know? All right. So, 75% of Caucasian Southerners did not own slaves. So, that is important to remember and keep in mind. Our large plantations that we're talking about that relied on slave labor, they represent the market that's coming out of the South, but that doesn't represent the majority of the people who make up the South. Um, that doesn't mean that racist sentiments weren't there by Southerners, okay? But for the majority, I'm talking about slave ownership um, in a broad sense, though, okay? So 75% of Caucasian Southerners did not own slaves, and most lived on self-sufficient farms. So yeah, this goes back to our Yemen class. So our small farmers, who relied on their children to help. I say upwards of a baker's dozen children to help with the labor. But so mostly Yemen class farmers are make up the majority of the populace. Okay. All right. So many farmers lived outside the plantation belt in hilly areas that were unsuitable for cotton production. And I've talked about this a couple times now, but yeah, whenever so our plantation owners, they have the money, they have the power, they get the best land, which is open and flat and the most likely to grow profitable crops. And everything that they don't want is left to everyone else. So that eventually becomes, when you get to the Appalachian Mountains and further on westward, but this will become our hilly areas, and those poor farmers that get that land become labeled as hillbillies, okay? But so this is really during that time when that becomes a true class within itself, I guess. Okay. Okay. Hilly areas unsuitable for cotton production, like I said. Family labor is what they mostly relied on. They raised livestock and grew food for their own use, not to sell at market, but yeah, to keep for their own sustainability. And purchasing relatively few goods at local stores was kind of the norm. It's not really until the Victorians that we become a consumer culture, and then by the 1920s, that's really reinforced. But so, really, just doing things for your own sustainability is the norm. All right. They were not integrated into the market economy, like I said. So, becoming consumers and buying ready-made tools, houseware, and then eventually food. But yeah, that's not until really after the Civil War, and then afterwards that we'll get into that. But so this is the main reason that the South did not develop much industry. They didn't, yeah, there wasn't outside of the plantation classes who are focusing on cotton cultivation. Our small Yemen class farmers, they don't see a need to focus on the national market, focus on these goods, all of that. Okay, we'll get to that later on, like I said. Okay. Also, like I said, So while 75% of our Caucasian Southerners didn't own slaves, the support for slavery was still there. Okay. So for our Yemen class, they widely supported the planter elite and slavery because that was the system that they knew, right? Um, so because of shared bonds, right, of regional loyalty, racism, and kinship ties. So this is, you know, multifaceted. There are a lot of aspects reinforcing this system. So while many might not have owned slaves, the support for the system itself was still there. Okay. Okay, a few like Andrew Johnson and Joseph Brown spoke out against the planter elite. So early abolitionists, and we'll get more into the anti-slavery movement. Okay. Okay, so the planter class, our elite. So in 1850, the majority of slaveholding families owned 5 slaves or fewer. Fewer than 40,000 families possessed 20 slaves or more that qualified them as planters. So our planter classes are like the largest um, slave owners. Okay. Okay. And fewer than 2,000 families owned 100 slaves or more. So 20 slaves qualified you as a planter class, and then the next, I guess, division within the system would be ranked by owning 100 slaves or more. Okay, so ownership of slaves proved the route to wealth, status, and influence within our planter class. Okay, slavery was a profit-making system, as we talked about. Men watched the world market for cotton, invested in the infrastructure, and carefully managed every detail of their plantations. Okay, plantation mistresses cared for 6 slaves, oversaw oversaw the domestic servants of the house, and supervised the plantation when their husbands were away. Okay. Southern slave owners spent much of their money on material goods, so that's starting to show this shift towards becoming a consumer nation, getting into the national market, getting material goods. Okay, so this is really that first push of that. And the wealthiest of our planter class spent money on lavish entertainment, vacations, and elegant mansions as a settled society developed in the Deep South. And they started to build their mansions based on a Greek revival style. So whenever you think of those plantation style homes, big whitewashed columns, yeah, that's a Greek revival style. Okay. So this is really beginning to get us into what we think of as the antebellum South. So that generation before the Civil War. Okay, so when everything's really start to build into a head, or come to a head, and that's with this planter class developing their own uh, lifestyle, yeah, so to speak. Okay. Okay, how am I doing? 25 minutes. So that's kind of what I was hoping for, so that's great. Okay. Let me see. Yeah, we'll talk about this for a sec because this goes in with our planter class still. Okay, so the paternalist ethos. And okay, I'll read through this and then we'll unpack it if necessary. Okay, so Southern slave owners were committed to a hierarchical, agrarian society in which they took personal responsibility for the physical and moral well-being of their dependents, which meant their wives, their children, and their slaves. Okay, so this idea of, yeah, it's literally a paternalist depiction of slave owners becoming this father over their domain, and they know best. Um, yes, okay. But so, unlike planters in the West Indies, many of whom were remained in Britain, they were absentee. They weren't, living on the plantations daily, seeing what was going on. Southern slave owners lived on their plantations and had year-round contact with their slaves. Okay, so this masked and justified uh, a brutal reality of slavery. Paternalism did. Paternalism was ingrained in slave society and enabled slave owners to think of themselves as a kind, responsible master, even as they bought and sold human property. Okay, so yeah, like I said, it creates kind of this. Well, it all just goes with the patriarchy of, father knows best, um, in any capacity. And so, yeah, that just ties into that. All right. Okay, so the pro-slavery argument. Okay, by the 1830s, fewer Southerners believed that slavery was a necessary evil. Instead, they claimed it as a basis for free institutions. Um, like I said, sorry, I was kind of processing on how to comment on that. That goes back to, I mentioned this just a minute ago. Um, Slavery had made its way into all of these different aspects of life that it, even if it was disagreed with, it was still believed to be just part of life. Okay. So, yeah, there's a shift away from this necessary evil, but it's still, we're starting to get into the abolition movement and recognize slavery as something that doesn't have to exist. Okay. So, we're starting to get into that. But the pro slavery argument, which will grow because as people start to challenge this, there has to be, I say has to be, there is a rebuttal of, well, but what's wrong with the old way? That's the way it's always been. Okay, so our pro slavery argument rested on a number of pillars, including the commitment to, well, I'll start with the historical precedent that slavery was, they believed it to be essential. It was also justified because there were biblical scriptures to historical slavery. So this became a justification. And something we've hit on before, by and large, white supremacy. Okay. So all of these things take root in the pro slavery argument. Okay. Okay. So, yeah, those three factors, just all of these factors interlacing together. But, and then another, oh no, okay, another pro slavery argument held that slavery guaranteed the equality of Caucasians. Um, Again, that just ties into white supremacy. Okay. Alrighty. Let me just see. Okay, I'll make this my last slide. So, abolition in the Americas. This is becoming a conversation. North and South, well, not just U.S., Americas. Oh. So collectively, the Western Hemisphere, they're all talking about this. Okay. So, in the first half of the 19th century, slavery was abolished in most of Spanish America, the British Empire. It's considered to be a declining institution. And abolition in the Americas influenced debates over slavery in the United States. All right. So pro-slavery advocates used the post-emancipation decline in sugar and other cash crops as evidence of British abolitionism's failure. Okay, so yeah, their justification was that we don't want this to have a negative effect on our economy. So Pretty weak argument, but whatever. Anyway, abolitionists argued that the former slaves' rising living standards and similar improvements showed that emancipation had succeeded. So, counterpoint to that, right? So, by the mid 1800s, New World slavery remained only in Cuba, Puerto Rico. Oh, there's a typo. It says Puerto Rice. Puerto Rico is what that should say. Brazil and the United States. Okay, so that's where we're at. It's mid 1800s, and like I said, the institution of slavery has morphed into this new. I keep using the term beast or monster, but that's really what it is. And abolitionism is starting to rise as um, a solution to this. So that is where we're at, and that's where I am going to stop this video. Okay. So I will pick back up. Our next slide is slavery and liberty. So we will start with that. All right. If you guys have any questions about anything, please send me an email, and otherwise I will talk to you later. Okay. Bye.